Get this heap of scrap metal out of my sight before I have it crushed into a cube, the young corporal barked, slapping the rusted hood of the '78 Ford with a disrespect that echoed louder than the tow truck's engine. He laughed, looking at his partner, a fresh-faced private who looked like he hadn't shaved a day in his life. Standing next to the driver's side door was the old man, Silas. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a restraint that only comes from surviving hell on earth. His knuckles were white as he gripped the side mirror, a mirror reflecting a face weathered by time and sorrow, crowned by a high and tight haircut that had long since turned silver. "Did you hear me, old-timer?" the corporal sneered, stepping into Silas's personal space. "This is a base for United States Marines, not a parking lot for your garbage." He didn't see the faded bumper sticker under the grime. He didn't see the scars on the old man's arms. He just saw a civilian in his way. But folks, this young guard didn't know who he was dealing with. He thought he was kicking around a confused geriatric. He had no idea he was poking a sleeping dragon. And what happens next is going to make you stand up and cheer. You need to see how this ends. Stick around. The asphalt at the main gate of Camp Lejeune was radiating heat, like an open oven door, the kind of humid, suffocating North Carolina air that sticks your uniform to your back the second you step outside, creating an atmosphere that was already tense enough to snap a banjo string. But for Silas, who had been standing in that baking sun for 45 minutes, the temperature was the least of his concerns because he was watching the only physical connection he had left to his past being treated like gear adrift by a couple of MPs who weren't even born when he was crawling through the mud in the Mekong Delta. The truck, a 1978 Ford F-150, was admittedly ugly to the untrained eye, its paint oxidized to a chalky blue and the wheel wells eaten by rust, looking like something you'd find in a salvage yard rather than parked near the pristine, manicured entrance of a premier military installation. Yet to Silas, that truck was a chariot, a survivor, a vessel that had carried him to VA appointments, to the gravesites of brothers long gone, and to the quiet corners of the county, where he could smoke a cigarette and remember the faces of men who never made it to be old. And now, here was Corporal Miller, a young buck with creases in his sleeves so sharp they could cut glass, and a demeanor that screamed, "I am the law," pacing around the vehicle with a look of utter disgust, tapping his clipboard with a pen as if calculating just how much of an inconvenience this old man was to his otherwise perfect shift. Miller was the type of Marine who looked good on paper, totally squared away in inspection, boots gleaming like obsidian, but he lacked that essential thing you can't teach in boot camp: respect for the path paved by those who came before him. He saw Silas's worn-out work boots, the flannel shirt that had been washed 1,000 times, and the baseball cap that was frayed at the brim, and he made a calculation, a judgment call that this man was a nobody, a civilian waster, a soup sandwich of a human being who had wandered too close to the high-speed world of the modern Corps. "I told you to move it, Pop," Miller said, his voice dripping with that specific kind of arrogance that only exists in a kid who has a little bit of rank and no combat experience, leaning in close enough that Silas could smell the mint gum on his breath, a sharp contrast to the scent of diesel and old tobacco that clung to the veteran. Silas just looked at him, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed to look right through the corporal, past the gate, and into a 1,000-yard distance that Miller couldn't comprehend. "I'm waiting for the general," Silas said, his voice gravelly and low, like tires rolling over crushed rock. "He knows I'm coming." Miller threw his head back and laughed, a harsh barking sound that made the private at the gate shack look up nervously, because even he sensed that something was off, that the air around this old man was heavier than it should be. "The general? You think the base commander, a 2-star general, knows a guy who drives a wreck like this? You've got to be kidding me. Listen, old-timer, I don't know what kind of senile fantasy you're living in, but you are blocking a VIP lane, and if you don't move this heap, I'm going to have it impounded, and I'm going to have you escorted off federal property in cuffs." You might think the old man is weak because he isn't shouting back. You might think he's confused, but trust me, you're looking at a sleeping lion. And the only reason he hasn't snapped yet is because he has more discipline in his little finger than that corporal has in his whole body. Silas tightened his grip on the door handle, his knuckles turning white again, and for a split second, a flash of something dangerous flickered in his eyes. A memory of violence, of rapid decisions, of a time when disrespect was met with a very different kind of response. But he swallowed it down, took a breath, and stood his ground. He wasn't going to let this boot provoke him into doing something that would dishonor the reason he was here. He needed to get that truck on base. He needed to get to the parade deck. It wasn't about the truck. It was about what was inside the glove box and what was stuck to that rear bumper, covered in dust but still holy to those who knew how to read the signs. Miller, sensing that his authority wasn't making the old man flinch, decided to escalate, signaling to the massive tow truck idling nearby. The driver, a civilian contractor looking bored and sweaty, shifting the rig into gear with a loud clank of chains that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. "Hook it up," Miller commanded, waving his hand dismissively at Silas. "Drag it out of here. If he wants it back, he can pay the impound fee at the provost marshal's office, assuming he can afford it." The disrespect was palpable, thick enough to chew on, a violation of the unwritten code that says you take care of your own, but Miller was too blinded by his own ego to see that he was violating the most sacred rule of the Brotherhood. He saw an old man and a junk truck. He didn't see a warrior and his steed. Stories like this matter to guys like us because we've all met a Miller, someone with power but no wisdom. Stay with me, because Silas is about to show this kid what old core really means. The tow truck backed up, the incessant beeping cutting through the humid air, and Silas took a step forward, his hand leaving the door and moving, instinctively, lightning fast, toward the corporal's chest, stopping just an inch away, a finger raised in warning. "You touch that truck, son, and you're going to regret it," Silas said. And this time, the volume didn't go up, but the temperature dropped about 10 degrees. It was the voice of a man who had issued final warnings to men much scarier than a 22-year-old MP. Miller blinked, momentarily stunned by the sudden shift in the old man's demeanor. The way the fragile geriatric suddenly looked like he was carved out of granite, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his subordinate. "Are you threatening a federal officer?" Miller asked, his hand drifting toward the pepper spray on his belt, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "That's it. Get him away from the vehicle. Tow it. Now." The chains rattled as they were dragged across the asphalt, the sound of metal hooks seeking purchase on the old Ford's frame sounding like bones breaking, and Silas stood there, forced to watch as the only thing he had left in this world was hooked up like a piece of garbage, his heart pounding a rhythm of rage and sorrow against his ribs, knowing that he was outnumbered, outranked in this civilian world and completely alone, or so he thought. The sound of the winch cable tightening against the frame of that old Ford was a sickening screech, a metal-on-metal scream that sounded like a wounded animal crying out in the humid air, and for Silas, it felt like his own ribs were being crushed by that tension because that truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a capsule of time, a mobile sanctuary that held the smell of his late wife's perfume in the upholstery and the ghost of his platoon in the cab. But Corporal Miller didn't hear a sanctuary dying. He only heard the satisfying noise of a problem being removed from his sight picture. The tow operator, a guy named Rigid who had grease under his fingernails and a cigarette dangling from his lip, cranked the lever, and the front end of the Ford rose into the air, the suspension groaning in protest as the tires left the asphalt they had traveled on for 40 years, and as the truck tilted backward, a cascade of old fast food wrappers and loose change slid off the dashboard. But crucially, a small, velvet-covered box slid from the passenger seat onto the floorboard, disappearing from view, and Silas lunged forward, his instinct to protect that box overriding his discipline for a fraction of a second. "Wait!" Silas shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation that he hadn't shown until this very moment, his hand reaching out to grab the door handle one last time. "My box. There's something inside I need. You can't take it with the gear inside." He wasn't asking for the truck back anymore. He knew that battle was lost to the arrogance of youth and the bureaucracy of the base. But he needed that box, because without it, the entire trip, the entire mission he had driven 600 miles for, was meaningless. Miller, however, saw the movement and reacted with the hyper-aggressive training of a man who sees threats where there are only grandfathers, stepping in front of Silas and shoving him back with a hard two-handed push to the chest that sent the old veteran stumbling backward, his boots skidding on the loose gravel near the guard shack. "Back off!" Miller screamed, his hand hovering over his baton now, his eyes wide with a mixture of adrenaline and disdain. "You do not approach the vehicle once it is hooked. That is a safety violation and an obstruction of justice. Do you want to spend the night in the brig, old man? Because I am about 2 seconds away from putting you face down on this pavement and cuffing you for assaulting a sentry." The audacity of the accusation, assaulting a sentry, hung in the air like a bad smell, because everyone watching, from the nervous private in the shack to the civilian contractors waiting in line behind the tow truck, knew that Silas hadn't assaulted anyone, that he was just a man trying to retrieve his property. But in the twisted power dynamic of the main gate, Miller was the king of the castle, and Silas was just a peasant at the drawbridge. This is where most men would crack. This is where a civilian would start screaming about lawyers, or where a weaker man would just collapse and cry. But this veteran, he's built different. He didn't fall. He caught his balance, straightened his spine, and looked Miller dead in the eye with a gaze that could peel paint off a bulkhead. Silas brushed the dust off his flannel shirt, a slow, deliberate motion that communicated more contempt than any curse word ever could, and he lowered his voice to a whisper that cut through the noise of the idling engines. "You have no idea what you are doing, son," Silas said, the word son landing like a slap in the face. "You are focused on the regulations, but you are missing the mission. That truck contains property that belongs to the Corps, property that I am delivering to the General, and if you drive off with it, you are interfering with official business that is way above your pay grade." Miller laughed again, a cruel, incredulous sound, and turned to the private. "Did you hear that? Now he's a courier. First he's a VIP, now he's delivering secret documents. Hey, maybe he's the Secretary of Defense in disguise." The mockery was designed to strip Silas of his dignity, to reduce him to a senile joke for the entertainment of the guard detail, and it was working on the surface, as the private let out a nervous chuckle, compelled to side with his NCO. But deep down, the air was getting thicker, charged with a moral static that was making the hair on the back of everyone's neck stand up. Just then, a pristine black government SUV with tinted windows rolled up to the adjacent lane, and the window rolled down to reveal a lieutenant, a young officer fresh out of Quantico, with a haircut that cost more than Silas's outfit, and a face that was smooth and untouched by the sun or the stress of combat. This was the butter bar, the second lieutenant, the authority figure who should have stepped in and corrected the situation, who should have recognized that an elderly man in distress at the gate required a conversation, not a towing. Miller immediately snapped to attention, his salute crisp and practiced, creating a facade of perfect military discipline. "Sir, just clearing a blockage, sir. We have a non-compliant civilian refusing to vacate the entrance." The lieutenant glanced at Silas, his eyes sweeping over the faded jeans, the worn boots, and the general disheveled appearance of a man who had been driving for 2 days straight. And in that split second, the officer made the same mistake the corporal did. He judged the book by its cover. He didn't see a veteran, he saw a vagrant. He didn't see a brother, he saw a bottleneck. "Carry on, Corporal," the lieutenant said, his voice bored and dismissive, barely even looking Silas in the eye. "Get that junk out of here. We have a convoy coming through in 20 mics, and I want this gate spotless." If he gives you any more trouble, call the local PD and have him trespassed. If this disrespect makes your blood boil, you're in the right place, because that lieutenant just proved that the rot doesn't just exist at the bottom, it creeps up the chain when people forget their roots. The window rolled up. The SUV purred away into the base, leaving Silas completely isolated, abandoned by the very institution he had bled for, and the betrayal of that moment hit him harder than a mortar round. It wasn't just Miller anymore. It was the officer corps, the new breed, the shiny brass who cared more about the optics of a clean gate than the reality of a struggling veteran. Miller turned back to Silas with a triumphant smirk, his power trip validated by the officer's dismissal. "You heard the lieutenant," Miller sneered, stepping closer, emboldened now, practically puffing his chest out like a rooster in a henhouse. "You are officially trespassing. The truck goes to the impound lot on the south side. You can walk there, it's about 4 miles that way. Get moving, or do I need to help you find the exit?" He pointed toward the civilian road, the long, dusty stretch of highway that led back to town, back to nowhere, and the tow truck driver finally finished securing the chains, revving the massive diesel engine of the wrecker, sending a black cloud of exhaust straight into Silas's face. Silas coughed, waving the smoke away, his eyes stinging, but he didn't move his feet. He stood there like a statue, watching the rear bumper of his truck rise higher, revealing the sticker that was caked in road mud, a sticker that Miller hadn't bothered to wipe off, a sticker that held the key to everything. The truck began to move, the tires bouncing as it was dragged away, and Silas felt a piece of his heart tearing loose, panic rising in his chest, not for himself, but for the promise he was breaking, for the deadline he was about to miss. He took a step after the truck, just one involuntary step, and Miller was there instantly, his hand clamping onto Silas's shoulder, digging his fingers in with unnecessary force, spinning the old man around. "I said, walk away," Miller shouted, and this time he shoved Silas hard enough that the old man stumbled, his boot catching on the curb, and he went down. Silas hit the asphalt, his hands scraping against the gritty surface, his knee slamming into the concrete with a sickening crack that shot pain up his leg, a sharp reminder of his age and his frailty. He lay there for a second, the heat of the road burning through his jeans, the taste of dust in his mouth, looking up at the towering figure of the young Marine standing over him, blocking out the sun. It was the ultimate image of defeat, the protector of the nation on his knees, looked down upon by the generation he saved. The private in the shack actually gasped, taking a half step out of the door, clearly thinking this had gone too far, but Miller didn't flinch. He just adjusted his belt, looking down at Silas with a look of utter contempt. "Look at you," Miller spat. "Pathetic. You want to play soldier? You can't even stand on your own 2 feet. Get off my base before I throw you in a cell." Silas slowly pushed himself up, his arms trembling, the pain in his knee radiating hot and sharp. But his face remained a mask of stoic resolve. He didn't cry out. He didn't beg. He simply dusted off his hands, wiped a smear of blood from his palm onto his jeans, and looked at the corporal with a terrifying calmness. He reached into his back pocket, not for a weapon, but for a small folded piece of paper, a map of the base. "You took my truck," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying across the distance like a gunshot. "But you can't take my destination. I am going to the parade deck, and I'm walking there if I have to crawl." Miller rolled his eyes, laughing as he turned back to the gate shack. "Good luck with that, Grandpa. It's 5 miles. You'll die of heat stroke before you pass the commissary. Now beat it." The tow truck disappeared around the bend, taking the metal, the memories, and the only transportation Silas had, leaving him stranded on the side of the road in 90-degree heat, with a bleeding hand and a bruised knee. You might think the story ends here. You might think he gives up, but you are looking at a man who walked out of the jungle when everyone else was carried out in bags. He isn't going to let a 5-mile walk stop him. And folks, What happens when he starts walking is going to start a chain reaction that nobody, especially Corporal Miller, sees coming. Silas turned his back on the gate, but instead of walking toward the town, he began to walk along the fence line, looking for the pedestrian gate, his limp noticeable but his pace steady, a rhythmic marching cadence kicking in from muscle memory that was 50 years old. Left, right, left. He wasn't just an old man walking, he was a Marine on patrol. The disrespect he had just endured was fuel, burning hot in his gut, converting sadness into a cold, hard determination to complete his mission. He had a meeting with the general. He had a promise to keep. And God help anyone who stood in his way now, because the humiliation hadn't broken him. It had sharpened him. He was no longer just a visitor. He was an operator behind enemy lines, and his objective was the reviewing stand. As he walked, the heat shimmering off the road, cars passing him by with drivers staring at the crazy old man hiking in the sun, Silas didn't look left or right. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the flag flying high in the distance above the base headquarters, the same flag he had almost died for, the same flag that Corporal Miller was currently disgracing with his arrogance. The stage was set. The injustice had been done. The weapon, the truck, was gone. But the warrior remained. And as Silas disappeared into the heat haze, marching toward his destiny, the universe began to align the pieces for a collision that would shake this base to its very foundations. Miller went back to his shack, cracked open a cold energy drink, and laughed with his private, thinking the problem was solved. He didn't know that he had just lit the fuse on a stick of dynamite that was sitting right under his own chair. To understand why Silas didn't turn around, why he didn't just sit on the curb and wait for the police, you have to understand the geography of his soul. As he placed one boot in front of the other on that blistering perimeter road, Silas wasn't just walking 5 miles, he was walking through 50 years of ghosts. The heat rising off the tarmac was a physical weight, a sensory echo of the jungle that triggered memories more real than the passing cars or the jeering MPs. He lived in the 1,000-yard stare, a place where the civilian world felt like a chaotic dream, and the past was the only solid ground. That truck, currently being dragged away like a carcass, was a reliquary of the old core. It was the only thing that didn't judge him. And inside the glove box, beneath a tire gauge, sat a velvet box heavier than a tank. It held the Medal of Honor belonging to Lieutenant Jimmy Carver, the man who had thrown himself on a grenade to save Silas in a rice paddy in 1968. Silas was on a final mission, with cancer eating away at his lungs, a parting gift from Agent Orange. He knew his time was short. He needed to place that medal in the hands of the new general, who was none other than Jimmy Carver's son. That was the tragic irony. The man leading this base was the son of the man who saved Silas's life, yet Silas was being treated like a vagrant by a child in uniform who didn't know the cost of his freedom. There is a reason Silas didn't shatter the corporal's jaw. It wasn't weakness, it was discipline. He focused on his breathing, ignoring the screaming pain in his knee, shattered by shrapnel and rebuilt with metal and grit. He thought about the bumper sticker on the truck, obscured by just enough Carolina mud to hide the text, Distinguished Service Cross, and Gallantry in Action. If Miller had just looked, he would have seen the Blue Max ribbon. But nobody looked anymore. They just saw an old man in a flannel shirt. In the civilian world, he was a pensioner, but inside his head, he was still a sergeant of Marines. He touched the pocket of his jeans, feeling the speech he had written on a napkin for the general. He couldn't let anger consume him. A soldier follows orders. A warrior follows a code. Silas was following a code written before Miller was even born. The pain in his leg was a white-hot poker. He was dehydrated and alone. Passing patrol cars slowed to laugh at the crazy old man, but Silas channeled the voice of his old drill instructor. Pain is weakness, leaving the body. You want to quit? Ring the bell. But if you want to be a Marine, you take one more step. Silas took that step. He visualized Jimmy Carver's face right before the explosion. That memory was the nuclear reactor in his chest. He wasn't going to fail Jimmy. He began to whisper the cadence to himself, a low chant matching his limp. Low right aleo, left, right, left. It was the heartbeat of the regiment. He checked his internal clock. The ceremony started at 1400. He had 15 minutes. He wasn't just Silas anymore. He was Sergeant Vance on active duty. He prayed that someone at the impound lot would have the decency to wash the truck. If they sprayed that mud off and saw the stickers, the panic would set in. But he couldn't rely on them. He had to rely on his boots. He passed a group of young Marines jogging in formation. They fell silent as they passed him, sensing the aura of hard radiating off him. He kept his eyes on the horizon. The sound of the Marine Corps band drifted on the wind, the brass, the drums. It called to him. He wiped the sweat from his eyes, set his jaw, and marched. He was going to finish this or die trying, and honestly, a warrior's death on the way to the objective was better than a hospital bed. He was alive. He was angry. And he was coming. The asphalt beneath his boots dissolved into the thick red clay of the Central Highlands, mud that sucked the boots right off your feet. The air grew heavy with the copper taste of adrenaline and the rotting stench of vegetation that had never seen the sun. Silas wasn't walking to a parade deck in 2024 anymore. He was back in the suck, back where time moved in heartbeats and cigarette drags. It was a violent sensory hijacking. The sound of passing cars was replaced by the deafening, insect-humming silence of the jungle, a silence that was just holding its breath before the scream. He felt the phantom weight of a flak jacket pressing on his chest, the canvas straps rubbing his skin raw. He smelled the terrifying cocktail of diesel, cordite, and fear. He was 20 years old again, a young buck sergeant. Beside him was Doc, checking his medical bag with shaking hands, and to his right was Lieutenant Jimmy Carver. Jimmy was covered in grime, looking like a swamp creature, but his piercing blue eyes scanned the tree line with the intensity of a hawk. "Stay low, Silas," the ghost whispered, so real that the old man on the road flinched. "Check fire." The tension broke with the devil's drumbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Incoming! The world dissolved into chaos. Mortars shook the ground, turning the valley into a kaleidoscope of brown and red. AK-47s cracked through the bamboo, green tracers floating like deadly fireflies. They were cut off, Fubar. Silas returned fire, his M16 bucking, shouting orders nobody could hear over the roar. Then time slowed. Silas saw a dark oval arc against the green canopy, a Chicom grenade. It landed with a soft thud in the mud between Silas and the radio man, hissing like a snake. Silas froze, his legs trapped in the muck. He calculated the distance and realized it was the end of the movie. But Jimmy didn't do the math. He didn't look for cover. He launched himself, a linebacker tackling a phantom. "Get down!" Jimmy roared, slamming his chest over the grenade, curling around it like a mother protecting a child. The explosion was a dull whoomp, absorbed almost entirely by the lieutenant's body. The shockwave knocked Silas back. Ringing silence. He crawled through the mud to the smoking crater. Jimmy was shattered, but his blue eyes were open, staring at the indifferent sky. "Silas," he bubbled, blood slipping past his lips. "The box. In my ruck." Silas leaned close, ignoring the bullets snapping overhead. "I got you, sir. Medevac is coming." Jimmy shook his head weakly. "No, listen, the box. For my boy. He's just a baby. Tell him I didn't run." "I promise, Jimmy," Silas sobbed, gripping the officer's hand. "I swear on my life." "Good man." The grip went slack. The lieutenant was gone. Amidst the returning roar of airstrikes, Silas cut the straps on Jimmy's ruck. He found it. A small wooden box containing a watch, a photo of a baby boy, and a letter. He shoved it against his heart. Something in Silas died that day, and a cold, hard resolve was born. He made a contract with the dead. The memory washed over him, blending with the reality of the North Carolina road. The smell of the jungle faded into the smell of exhaust. Silas stumbled, catching his boot on the pavement. He was back. He was old. He was in pain. But the feeling of the box, now the metal case in his pocket, was exactly the same. The ghost of Jimmy Carver was walking right beside him. Tell him I didn't run. The disrespect at the gate, the towing of the truck, it all felt petty now. What was an insult compared to a grenade? Silas straightened his back. The limp remained, but the stride lengthened. He wiped 50-year-old tears from his eyes and looked at the headquarters building looming ahead. "I'm coming, Jimmy," he whispered to the empty air. The flash echo receded, leaving him raw but stronger. He had refueled at the well of grief. The shiny brass thought they were holding a ceremony. They had no idea they were about to host a resurrection. The past was coming for them, walking on two bad legs and carrying a heart full of fire. The parade deck was a geometry problem solved with white paint and discipline. The bleachers were filled with families, the air thick with starch and polish. Into this pristine ecosystem limped a variable the operations plan hadn't accounted for: Silas. He emerged from the heat haze like a specter, his flannel shirt dark with sweat, jeans coated in road dust. To the mothers and young wives, he looked like a vagrant, a blemish on their perfect day. Silas didn't see them. His world had narrowed to the empty chair reserved for the commanding general. He reached the red velvet rope, his breath coming in ragged rasps. A staff sergeant with a clipboard immediately beelined for him, face set in professional annoyance. "Sir, you can't be here," he projected. "This is a restricted area. The general public entrance is on the north side. Move back." Silas wiped grit from his eyes. I have something for the general," he wheezed. "I need to sit." The staff sergeant sighed, keying his headset to call an MP. He thought he was taking out the trash. He had no idea the hammer was about to drop. While Silas was being blocked 4 miles away at the impound lot, Henderson, a salty civilian contractor, was blasting the mud off the 78 Ford. As the high-pressure water sliced through the clay on the rear bumper, colors revealed themselves: blue, white, red. Henderson stopped. He leaned in closer. "Distinguished Service Cross," he read aloud. "Purple Heart, K-San survivor." A chill went down his spine. He popped the glove box and found a letter. To General Carver, regarding the actions of Lieutenant James Carver. "Oh, sweet Jesus, no," Henderson whispered. He scrambled for his radio. "Dispatch, get the Provost Marshal. We have a code red. You guys towed the wrong truck. Repeat, you towed the wrong truck." The panic in his voice crackled over the airwaves, filtering into the earpieces of the shiny brass. The system was waking up to its mistake. Back at the parade deck, the staff sergeant lost patience. He grabbed Silas's arm, the same arm that took a bullet in 1968. "Don't touch me," Silas whispered, a flash of the old warrior surfacing. "I am waiting for the general." Suddenly the crowd parted. Walking through the VIP section like a tank was Sergeant Major Bull Rodriguez, 6'4", a chest full of ribbons and a presence that could stop a clock. Bull didn't see a bum. He saw the 1,000-yard stare and the combat injury in the knee. Bull walked up to the staff sergeant. "Problem?" "Sir is refusing to clear the area, Sergeant Major," the sergeant stammered. Bull looked at Silas. He saw the scars. He saw the dignity. Then, Bull's earpiece crackled. "All stations be advised," the panicked voice of the Provost Marshal came over the net. "Confirmed error on the tow. Vehicle belongs to highly decorated veteran Silas Vance. Treat with extreme courtesy. The general is en route and is not happy." The color drained from the staff sergeant's face. He dropped his hand as if he had been burned. Bull turned to him, voice low and terrifying. "Did you put your hands on him?" The sergeant stuttered. Bull stepped over the velvet rope, breaking protocol to shield the old man. "Sir," Bull said gently, "I'm Sergeant Major Rodriguez. Are you Silas Vance?" "I am." Silas whispered. It belongs to his father. Bull nodded solemnly. I know, sir. We know. He offered his arm. You don't stand outside the rope, not on my watch. He barked at the terrified staff sergeant. Get a chair. Front row, now. Silas leaned heavily on Bull's arm, relief washing over him. He had breached the perimeter. The heavy thumping of a helicopter cut through the air. The big brass was inbound. The door opened, and out stepped General Carver, the spitting image of the lieutenant who died in the mud 50 years ago. He listened to the provost marshal for a second, looked toward the VIP tent, and then did the unthinkable. He ran. A two-star general sprinting across the parade deck toward the old man in the dirty flannel shirt. The band faltered. The crowd gasped. This wasn't in the script. This was a son finding the ghost of his father. Silas watched him come, the image of Jimmy rushing toward him. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the velvet box. The journey was over. The reckoning was about to begin. And for Corporal Miller back at the gate, the worst day of his life was just getting started. The sound of the general's boots hitting the pavement as he sprinted toward the VIP section was a rhythm that broke every protocol in the book, a frantic human cadence that cut through the sterile perfection of the military ceremony like a knife, and for the thousands of Marines standing in formation on that deck, the sight of a two-star major general running, actually running, was enough to cause a collective ripple of shock that traveled down the ranks faster than a rumors in a barracks. The helicopter rotors were still spinning down in the distance, a dying whine that underscored the sudden, suffocating silence that had fallen over the grandstands, a silence so heavy you could hear the flags snapping in the breeze. General Carver didn't look like a statue today. He looked like a desperate man, his face flushed, his eyes locked onto the dusty, trembling figure of Silas Vance, held up by the massive frame of Sergeant Major Rodriguez. The staff sergeant who had tried to block Silas was now standing at a rigid position of attention, his face the color of ash, looking like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole, because he realized in that terrifying instant that he had just tried to evict the most important guest on the base. Carver slowed as he reached the rope line, his chest heaving slightly, not from exertion but from the sheer emotional weight of the moment, and he stopped 3 feet from Silas, his eyes widening as he took in the reality of the man before him. He saw the high and tight that was 50 years out of regulation. He saw the cheap flannel shirt stained with sweat and road dust. He saw the swollen knee that was buckling under the weight of the years. But most importantly, he saw the face he had seen in the grainy black and white photos his mother had kept on the mantel, the face of the young sergeant who had stood next to his father in the jungle. Sergeant Vance? The general asked, his voice cracking, stripping away all the command authority and leaving just a son. Is it really you? Silas straightened up, pushing himself off Bull's arm, summoning the last reserves of his strength to stand on his own 2 feet, because you do not slouch in front of a general, no matter how much pain you are in. It's me, sir, Silas rasped, his voice rough with dehydration. I'm sorry I'm late. I had some trouble at the gate. The general's eyes flickered with a sudden, dangerous fire as he glanced at the staff sergeant and then back to Silas's condition, connecting the dots of the dust and the exhaustion. Trouble? Carver repeated, the word coming out like a curse. You walked? You walked here? Silas nodded slowly, reaching into his pocket with a shaking hand. They took the truck, sir, said it was junk, but I couldn't leave this behind. He pulled out the velvet box, the box he had fought to keep, the box that had been the center of his universe for 5 decades. He held it out, his hand trembling violently now. Your father, Jimmy, he told me to give this to you. He said to tell you he didn't run. He stood his ground, sir. He saved us. I told you justice was coming. Watch the look on that young officer's face as the weight of history crashes down on him. The general stared at the box, his breath catching in his throat, and he reached out with both hands, treating the object like it was made of fragile glass. He opened it. The Medal of Honor gleamed in the sunlight, the blue ribbon stark against the velvet, a symbol of ultimate sacrifice that silenced the entire world around them. Carver's eyes filled with tears, tears that spilled over and ran down the cheeks of a man who was supposed to be made of stone. He looked from the medal to Silas, and then, without a word, he dropped to one knee. A general kneeling in the dirt before a private citizen. The crowd gasped, an audible, collective intake of breath. "You kept it," Carver whispered, his voice thick with emotion. 50 years, you kept it. Silas looked down, uncomfortable with the reverence, just a grunt doing his job. "I promised him, sir, semper fi." But the moment wasn't done. The universe demanded balance. A siren wailed in the distance, growing louder, and around the corner of the parade deck a convoy appeared. Not a parade convoy, but a frantic escort. 2 military police cruisers, lights flashing, were escorting a massive tow truck that was moving way too fast for a parade deck. It was the impound unit. They had found the truck, they had seen the sticker, and they were terrified. The tow truck screeched to a halt 50 yards away, and the driver, Henderson, jumped out, waving his arms, while the MPs, including a very pale Corporal Miller, scrambled out of the cruisers. They had brought the junk truck back, realizing too late that they had stolen a reliquary. General Carver stood up, wiping his eyes, his demeanor shifting instantly from grief to cold, hard command. He looked at the truck, that beat-up, rusted Ford F-150 sitting incongruously on the pristine asphalt. He saw the mud, he saw the age, and then he walked toward it. The crowd watched, mesmerized. Silas limped after him, supported by Bull. The general walked right up to the rear bumper where Henderson had power-washed the mud away. He read the sticker. 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, Gallantry in Action. He saw the faded caisson decal. He saw the bumper sticker that read, "My son is a general." Silas had put that on there years ago, a silent boast he never told anyone about. Carver froze. He looked at the sticker, then back at Silas. He realized that this old man hadn't just preserved a medal. He had lived a life of quiet pride in a man he barely knew. The general turned to the MPs, to Corporal Miller, who was standing there shaking, looking like he was about to vomit. Carver didn't scream. He didn't shout. He just pointed to the truck. "Who authorized this?" Carver asked, his voice low, carrying the terrifying weight of a storm about to break. "Who called this vehicle junk?" Miller tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was watching his career evaporate. The general turned back to Silas, and then, in front of God and the entire Marine Corps, General Carver snapped a salute. It wasn't a quick salute. It was a slow, 3-second hold, rigid, perfect, vibrating with respect. He wasn't saluting an officer. He was saluting the man. He was saluting the truck. He was saluting the blood in the mud. "Order arms," Carver whispered to himself, dropping the salute. He turned to the crowd, to the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony. He walked over, grabbed the mic, and his voice boomed across the speakers, echoing off the barracks. "Ladies and gentlemen, Marines, I want you to look at that truck. You might see rust. You might see garbage." He pointed a finger at Silas, who was standing tall, tears finally streaming down his own face. "But I see a chariot, and I see a hero. This man walked 5 miles on a shattered knee to bring me my father's soul. And from this day forward, if anyone, and I mean anyone, disrespects a veteran on this base, they will answer to me personally." He turned back to Miller. "Get that truck off the hook, now, and wash it, by hand, with your toothbrush if you have to. If you live for moments where arrogance meets reality, this is why you're here. The bully is broken. The hero is elevated, and the truck is about to get the VIP treatment." The MPs scrambled, tripping over themselves to lower the Ford. The crowd erupted, not a polite applause, but a roar, a thunderous ovation that shook the stands. Veterans in the audience were crying. The young Marines in formation were standing a little taller, understanding suddenly what the uniform really meant. Silas just stood there, patting the pocket where the empty box had been, feeling a weight lift off his soul that had been there since 1968. The mission was complete, the promise was kept, and the general was hugging him now, tight, like a long-lost father. It was a mess. It was beautiful. It was the core. The roar of the crowd faded into a heavy, respectful silence, leaving only the sound of flags snapping in the wind and Corporal Miller's ragged breathing. He stood rigid, terrified, knowing his Marine Corps career was effectively over. General Carver stood inches away, veins bulging, ready to unleash a legendary dressing down that would strip the stripes off Miller's collar. The disrespect shown to Silas was a stain on the command, and the general was ready to scorch the earth. Carver opened his mouth to destroy the young man, but a hand, calloused and shaking, landed on his shoulder. Silas stepped between the wrath of the two-star general and the trembling corporal. "Easy, General," Silas rasped, his voice like tires on broken glass. "Belay that order, sir." The phrase hung in the air, shocking audacity. But Silas spoke as a senior NCO of the old Corps, a man who had earned the right in blood. Carver stopped, looking at Silas with confusion and respect. "He disrespected you, Sergeant," Carver said tightly. "He treated a Medal of Honor courier like a vagrant. He needs to be made an example of." Silas studied the fear in the young man's eyes. He didn't see a monster, he saw a boot, a kid with power but no wisdom. He could have destroyed him. Instead, he chose to teach him. Silas reached into the truck bed and pulled out a dirty, oil-stained rag. He held it out to Miller. "Take it," Silas commanded, firm as a grandfather teaching a child. Miller took it with trembling hands. "Wipe the bumper. Finish the job you started." Miller dropped to his knees on the hot asphalt and began scrubbing the mud, obscuring the gallantry in action text. Silas stood over him, addressing the entire formation. "You looked at this truck and you saw junk," Silas announced. "You saw rust, so you treated the driver like junk." He tapped a dent on the fender with his cane. "You see this dent, son? I got that in 1982, the day I found out I had cancer. That dent is the day I decided to fight for my life." Miller stopped scrubbing, looking up. Silas moved his cane to a scratch. "And this scratch? From a cooler of beer I hauled to a reunion in '95, the last time I saw my radio operator alive. This isn't a truck, Corporal. It's a timeline. It's a survivor. Your job is to protect the story." Miller looked at the clean bumper, finally reading the Quezon citation. Tears mixed with the sweat on his face. I didn't know, sir," he whispered. "I just saw the regulations. I'm so sorry." Silas took the rag back, brushing the young Marine's shoulder. "I know. You're too busy looking at regulations to look for the scars." He turned to the general. "Don't court-martial this boy. Sergeant Vance, If you kick him out, he learns nothing," Silas interrupted. "But if you make him drive this truck back to my house, 600 miles, and make him listen to the stories of every dent and scratch along the way, you might just make a Marine out of him yet." Carver paused, then smiled grimly. "Excellent suggestion. Corporal, you are assigned as Sergeant Vance's driver. You will escort him home. You will wash this truck, and you will listen. Do I make myself clear?" Miller snapped a salute, relief flooding his voice. "Crystal clear, sir. Thank you, Sergeant Vance." He wasn't getting off easy. He was going to boot camp for the soul. "Mission accomplished, sir," Silas said, wincing as he opened the passenger door. "My watch is over." "Not yet," Carver said. "You're riding shotgun. We're getting that knee looked at before you leave." Silas didn't argue. He climbed into the passenger seat, sinking into the upholstery. It felt like victory. Miller climbed into the driver's seat with a reverence he had never shown before. "Ready, sir?" Miller asked. Silas lit an unfiltered cigarette, defying every regulation. "Drive on, Corporal, and don't grind the gears." As the truck sputtered to life, the general shouted, "Present! Arms!" Thousands of Marines snapped a salute. The crowd cheered. Silas Vance rode through the tunnel of honor, not as a nuisance, but as a king. He looked in the mirror, seeing the general holding the medal. The debt was paid. And Corporal Miller, knuckles white on the wheel, was driving 10 miles per hour, learning his first real lesson. Respect isn't written in a manual. It's earned on the road. Listen to me closely. That truck wasn't just metal and rubber. It was a vessel for the values we are losing every single day. We live in a world that is quick to judge, quick to tow, and quick to throw away anything that looks a little worn out or a little slow. We see an old man, and we see a burden. We see a dent, and we see garbage. But Silas Vance taught us that the most valuable things in this life often look like wrecks on the outside. It took a general running across a parade deck to remind us that rank is just a badge, but character is a lifestyle. Silas could have ruined that young corporal. He had the power. But he chose to build him up instead. That is the old Corps way. That is what it means to be a keeper of the flame. If this story made you pick up the phone and call an old battle buddy, or if it made you look at an old veteran in the grocery store with a little more patience, then we've done our job. These stories aren't just entertainment, they are reminders. comprehend. "I'm waiting for the general," Silas said, his voice gravelly and low, like tires rolling over crushed rock. "He knows I'm coming." Miller threw his head back and laughed, a harsh barking sound that made the private at the gate shack look up nervously, because even he sensed that something was off, that the air around this old man was heavier than it should be. "The general? You think the base commander, a two-star general, knows a guy who drives a wreck like this? You've got to be kidding me. Listen, old-timer, I don't know what kind of senile fantasy you're living in, but you are blocking a VIP lane, and if you don't move this heap, I'm going to have it impounded, and I'm going to have you escorted off federal property in cuffs." You might think the old man is weak because he isn't shouting back. You might think he's confused, but trust me, you're looking at a sleeping lion. And the only reason he hasn't snapped yet is because he has more discipline in his little finger than that corporal has in his whole body. Silas tightened his grip on the door handle, his knuckles turning white again, and for a split second, a flash of something dangerous flickered in his eyes. A memory of violence, of rapid decisions, of a time when disrespect was met with a very different kind of response. But he swallowed it down, took a breath, and stood his ground. He wasn't going to let this boot provoke him into doing something that would dishonor the reason he was here. He needed to get that truck on base. He needed to get to the parade deck. It wasn't about the truck. It was about what was inside the glove box and what was stuck to that rear bumper, covered in dust but still holy to those who knew how to read the signs. Miller, sensing that his authority wasn't making the old man flinch, decided to escalate, signaling to the massive tow truck idling nearby. The driver, a civilian contractor looking bored and sweaty, shifting the rig into gear with a loud clank of chains that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. "Hook it up," Miller commanded, waving his hand dismissively at Silas. "Drag it out of here. If he wants it back, he can pay the impound fee at the provost marshal's office, assuming he can afford it." The disrespect was palpable, thick enough to chew on, a violation of the unwritten code that says you take care of your own. But Miller was too blinded by his own ego to see that he was violating the most sacred rule of the Brotherhood. He saw an old man and a junk truck. He didn't see a warrior and his steed. Stories like this matter to guys like us because we've all met a Miller, someone with power but no wisdom. Stay with me, because Silas is about to show this kid what Old Core really means. The tow truck backed up, the incessant beeping cutting through the humid air, and Silas took a step forward, his hand leaving the door and moving, instinctively, lightning fast, toward the corporal's chest, stopping just an inch away, a finger raised in warning. "You touch that truck, son, and you're going to regret it," Silas said. And this time, the volume didn't go up, but the temperature dropped about 10 degrees. It was the voice of a man who had issued final